The envelope came on heavy cream cardstock with my mother's monogram pressed into the flap, and tucked behind the gilt-edged invitation was a smaller note in her looping handwriting that I'd recognized since I was a girl. It said, "Sweetheart, this is black tie. Real black tie, not the sad business clothes you wear to that little office of yours. Your sister has worked so hard to bring Spencer's family into our lives, and we simply can't have you turning up looking like you came straight off a GO train. If you can't pull it together, it might be kinder to everyone if you stayed home with the baby." Dad agrees. That was it. That was the whole message. Have you ever stood in your own kitchen holding a piece of paper that your mother licked and sealed and felt like a stranger in the family that made you? I read it 3 times. My daughter was at the table behind me, 4 years old, tongue poking out the side of her mouth while she colored a moose entirely purple because purple was, in her words, the best one. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because for years I thought not crying meant something was wrong with me. It doesn't. I just went very still, the way I do when a number on a spreadsheet doesn't reconcile and I know somebody is hiding something. My whole life had felt like that for a long time, a statement that didn't add up. If you've ever been the one in your family that everyone quietly decided was a disappointment, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is for you. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who learned to smile while the people who were supposed to love them did the math on whether they were worth the trouble. I set the note down on the counter, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and picked up my phone. My mother answered on the second ring, bright as a porch light. "Oh, did you get it? Doesn't the calligraphy look gorgeous?" I drove all the way out to that little stationer in Yorkville. "I got it," I said, "and the note." A pause. I could hear her rehearsing. My mother always paused before she said something unkind, the way a diver pauses on the board. Now don't take it the wrong way. We just want everything to be perfect for your father. 60 years old, can you believe it? And Spencer's father is going to be there. You know who his father is? "A cabinet minister," I said. "You've mentioned it." Federal cabinet, sweetheart, infrastructure. These are serious people. Old money, the right schools. Your sister has a real chance here and I won't have anything spoil it, you understand. You're a single mother working at, what is it again, some little consulting thing downtown, and you've got the baby, and frankly, you always look so tired. I'm not saying don't come, I'm just saying maybe it's better if you don't. There it was, not uninvited, just gently shown the door of the family I'd bankrolled in 100 quiet ways they never noticed. "I understand perfectly, Mom," I said. "Happy birthday to Dad." And I hung up before she could decide whether I'd been agreeable enough. Here's the part my mother didn't know, the part none of them knew, because I'd let them not know for 7 years. The little consulting thing downtown was Stonehaven Infrastructure Partners, and I wasn't a clerk there. I was the chief strategy officer. I sat across the table from deputy ministers and bond underwriters and the kind of lawyers who bill more in an afternoon than my father's firm cleared in a month. 3 years ago, I'd quietly pulled apart a procurement file for a $4 billion provincial transit and clean energy build, found the rot in it before it became a public inquiry, and rewritten the framework that saved the government from a scandal that would have ended careers all the way up to the Premier's office. The people who worked beside me on that file didn't even know my real name. They knew a code on a document. But the Premier knew my name. The Premier of Ontario had shaken my hand in a windowless room at Queen's Park and told me I had the clearest head he'd ever worked with, and that if I ever needed anything, I should call him, not his office. Him. To my parents, I was a cautionary tale. I'd gotten pregnant in my 2nd year of law school. The father decided that fatherhood didn't fit his plan, packed a duffel bag, and was gone before the morning sickness ended. I left law school. My father had sat me down in his study, the one with the leather chairs he bought to look like a man who read, and told me, "This is a setback, not a death sentence. There are options." When I told him I was keeping her, his face closed like a garage door. "Be realistic," he said. "No degree, no career, no man. You'll be scraping by your whole life and dragging that child through it." My mother cried and asked what she was supposed to tell the women at her club. I didn't go back to law school. I went to work instead, a junior analyst at a tiny firm that did government contracts nobody else wanted to touch. 60-hour weeks with a newborn asleep in a bassinet beside my desk because I couldn't afford care and wouldn't ask them for $1. I was good at it. I was better than good. By the time my daughter was learning to walk, I'd been poached by Stonehaven. By the time she was 3, I was running a division. I bought a house, a real one, in a good school district north of the city, paid off the mortgage in 5 years, and put aside enough in her respite that she'll never have to choose between a child and a degree the way I did. My family had no idea. At the rare dinners I forced myself to attend, my father would ask, "Still doing the little admin job?" And I'd say, "Something like that," and watch my mother slide her hand-me-down designer handbags across the table to me like alms for your interviews, dear. My sister offered to put in a good word at the boutique where she worked weekends for fun. I drove a sensible little hatchback to those dinners because the car I actually drove would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I let them believe every small, sad thing they wanted to believe. It was easier. It was even, in a strange way, a kindness, although I'm not sure to whom. So I stood in my kitchen with the cream cardstock and the purple mousse and the dial tone still warm in my ear, and I made a different call. The premier picked up on the 3rd ring. "Twice in 1 week," he said. "Should I be worried?" "The quarterly review on the corridor file," I said. "The one we keep rescheduling because your calendar's a war crime. I want to do it Saturday." "Saturday's a write-off. I've got." "The Fairmont? 7 o'clock. Private dinner. I'll have the compliance package ready and you can finally sign off on the Western alignment." I let a beat go by. "It's my father's 60th. Same ballroom. I think I'm done sitting at the kids' table." There was a silence and then a low laugh that I'd come to recognize as the sound of a man who liked watching certain people get what was coming to them. "I'll bring my wife," he said, "and if it's a family thing, she'll bring our granddaughter. They're staying with us this month. Your little one and ours can wreck a tablecloth together. Center of the room, I assume?" "Center of the room," I said. I closed the laptop I hadn't even opened, which is a thing I do when I've made a decision, like clicking a pen. I looked at my daughter, who held up her mousse for inspection. "It's purple," she announced. "It's perfect," I said. "Pack your fancy shoes, Junie. We're going to a party." The next few days I worked the way I always do when something matters, which is quietly and completely. I didn't go to a mall and stand under fluorescent lights, second-guessing myself. I called a stylist I'd used once for a board gala, and she came to my house with a rack. I chose a long charcoal gown, no sequins, no story, just a clean architectural line that said I had nothing to prove because I'd already proven it. One thing at my throat, a small drop of a diamond my daughter liked to touch. I put my hair up the way I wear it when I'm going to take a room apart, and when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the disappointing one. I saw a woman who'd built a life with her bare hands while the people who were supposed to help her stood across the room and graded her. My sister texted me the afternoon of the party, a photo of herself in a gown that cost more than my first car, hair lacquered into a cloud, captioned, "Thinking of you, sis. Don't worry, I'll tell everyone you were just too busy with the baby. Honestly, it's for the best. You wouldn't want to be the only one there without a real label. Stay cozy." I didn't answer. I looked at the time, 6:45. We took the real car. Junie pressed her nose to the window the whole way downtown, naming every Christmas display because to her, December meant lights, and she didn't know or care that her mother's hands were perfectly steady on the wheel for the first time in 7 years. When we pulled up to the Fairmont, the valet didn't see a tired single mom. He saw the car, and then he saw the gown, and the whole front of the hotel rearranged itself around us the way the world does when it decides you matter. The premier and his wife were waiting in the lobby. His wife crouched right down to Junie's level and said, "You must be the famous purple mousse artist. Our Maeve has been talking about you all day," and led my daughter off by the hand toward a little girl in a green velvet dress who immediately produced a fistful of crayons. The premier offered me his arm, dry and amused. "Your file's in good order, I assume," he said. "I'd hate to walk you in here only to find a discrepancy." "My files are always in order," I said. It's the only thing in my life that ever was. We didn't go toward the private annex where, through the glass, I could see my family's long table set for 25. My father already pink-faced and beaming at the head of it in his rented tux, my mother orbiting Spencer like a moth, my sister narrating something to a row of glazed faces. We went to the round booth at the dead center of the main floor, the one the hotel keeps for whoever happens to be the most important person in the building that night, positioned so that anyone walking back to the private rooms has to pass it. The premier pulled out my chair. His aide set a leather folder at my elbow. His wife and the two girls were already laughing about something 3 tables over. I saw my sister first, out by the bar with a drink in her hand, her eyes drifting across the room and snagging on me. I watched it happen in real time, the way her face went from confusion to recognition to something close to fear, and then she grabbed my mother's wrist, and my mother turned and almost dropped her glass. They didn't understand it. In their world, I was the spare part, the cautionary tale, the daughter who came off the go train. And here the premier of the province was leaning toward me with a folder of state business, asking my opinion on a $4 billion corridor, deferring to me the way a man defers to the one person at the table who actually understands the thing under discussion. Before the food, the premier said, loud enough to carry, walk me through the Western alignment. Your sign-off's the only thing standing between me and a very bad Monday. I opened the folder. Of course, I said. Let's work. At 7:25, the big doors swung open and the birthday procession came through. My father led, chest out, a man who'd spent 60 years convinced that looking the part was the same as being it. My mother behind him, sweeping the room with her eyes to be sure everyone clocked her. My sister next, draped in red, clamped onto Spencer's arm like he was a winning lottery ticket she was afraid would blow away. And behind them, 20 more, aunts, uncles, the firm's accountant, men my father wanted to impress, and women my mother wanted to outshine. To reach the annex, every single one of them had to walk past the center of the room, past me. I watched the exact second my father saw me. He stopped so suddenly that the woman behind him stepped on his heel, 3 feet from the booth, and his face cycled through it all. Confusion, irritation, and then, when he registered the man across from me, a jolt of pure animal panic. My mother came up behind his shoulder and went the color of dishwater. What are you doing here? She whispered. I didn't stand. I didn't reach for my napkin. I looked up and kept my voice even and pleasant. The voice I use when I'm holding all the cards and want everyone to feel how calm I am about it. Hi, Mom. Happy birthday, Dad. The premier rose, unhurried, the way powerful men move when they want a room to slow down and watch. He put out his hand. You'd be the father. 60 years old, I hear. Congratulations. A small, knife-edged smile. I've heard a great deal about this family's attention to appearances. My father shook the premier's hand on pure reflex, his mouth opening and closing. Premier, I had no idea you were a friend of my daughter's. A friend. The premier let the word sit there until it curdled. She's rather more than that. She's been steering one of the most important files my government has touched in a decade. There are people in my cabinet who can't make a decision until she's reviewed it. He glanced at me, almost fond. I'd be in a great deal of trouble without her. My sister shoved forward then, 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. Steering a file? She's an admin. She does data entry. She dropped out of law school. She's been a struggling single mom on a clerk's salary for 7 years. I would know. The silence around the booth was the kind you can hear. And then Spencer, who hadn't said a word, who'd been staring at me with his head tilted like he was trying to place a song, said quietly, Wait, Adeline Quinn? I looked at him. That's right. He looked at my father, then back at me, and the color ran out of his face. You're the Adeline Quinn, from Stonehaven. My father talks about you constantly. He says you're the only reason the Eastern Corridor procurement didn't turn into a public inquiry that would have taken half the ministry down with it. He's been trying to get you onto the Federal Infrastructure Board for a year. He says you're the sharpest mind in the country on this stuff and you keep saying no. He swallowed. He's going to lose it when I tell him you were here. My father sat down. Not at a chair at his own table. He just folded into the nearest seat, an empty one belonging to strangers, blocking the aisle, not even noticing. "No," he said. "No, that's not. She works as an assistant. She has no degree. She told us she was fine," she said. "I never told you I was fine," I said. And the room around our booth had gone fully quiet now. 20 relatives and a constellation of the province's most powerful people all leaning in to watch a family come apart. "I told you something like that and let you fill in the rest, because the truth is you never once asked. You decided who I was the day I chose my daughter over your approval, and then you spent 7 years being embarrassed by a person who doesn't exist." I kept my voice level, almost gentle, which I've learned is far more devastating than shouting. "I run the strategy division at Stonehaven. I've sat across from this man on files I'm not allowed to describe to you. My house is paid off, my daughter's education is paid for, and I drove a different car to your dinners so you wouldn't have to feel anything you weren't ready to feel." My mother's hand went to her throat. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" "Because your opinion of me was never about me," I said. "It was about the version of me you needed to make her shine." I didn't look at my sister when I said it, but everyone else did. You needed a baseline of failure. If I'd been the struggling clerk you imagined, I'd be home tonight eating leftovers while you toasted Spencer's family, and that's exactly how you wanted it. My sister's face twisted. "You did this on purpose. You set this whole thing up to humiliate us on Dad's birthday." "I'm having a working dinner with the premier," I said. "You're the ones who stopped at my table. You uninvited me because you were worried about the label on my dress. I came because I had business in this building anyway." I turned back to my father, and this was the part I'd thought about for 3 days, the part where the audit closes. I touched the leather folder. "Speaking of business, Dad, your firm's the lead bidder on the regional supply package for the corridor build, isn't it? The one that would take you national, the one you've been telling everyone is going to make you." My father's eyes lit with a desperate, scrambling hope that was honestly hard to look at. Yes, Adeline, that contract is everything. If you put in a word with the premier." The premier said nothing at all. He simply opened one hand toward me, handing the entire weight of the province across the table and letting it land in front of my father like a verdict. "I've already reviewed your bid," I said, "and there's a problem. There's a $400,000 entry in your subsidiary's filings from 3 years ago that I couldn't reconcile, so I pulled the supporting document, and the signature authorizing it is mine." I let that land, except I never signed it. "You forged my name on a personal guarantee to keep the firm liquid through a bad quarter because you didn't think the disappointing daughter would ever be in a position to read your books." I have never watched a man age that fast. The blood left his face from the top down. "Your firm is already under provincial compliance review," I went on, and my voice had dropped into the flat, clinical register I use for boardrooms, the one that has ended deals worth more than my father will ever understand. "As the chief strategy officer on the prime contract, I'm the one who has to sign the fit and proper certification before any subcontractor can be cleared to bid. That's me, Dad. That's my name, the real one." "Adeline, please." My mother had started to cry, and she reached across the table to put her hand on my arm. "We're family. You can't do this to your father. He'll lose everything. We'll lose the house." I moved my arm before she could touch me. Not roughly, I just moved it. "This is what the silence cost," I said, and I looked right at her. 7 years I stayed quiet while you judged me. I stayed quiet while you cut me out of things. I stayed quiet the day you sat in my kitchen and told me I'd ruined my life, and I stayed quiet when he forged my name to cover his own. I gave you every chance to be the family you keep saying we are, and tonight you told me I wasn't appropriate for your world." I picked up the pen from beside the folder, a heavy thing the aide had set there, "So I'm going to be professional about it." I didn't sign the approval. I signed the formal notice of non-compliance and the suspension of bidding rights, and I slid the folder shut and I handed it to the premier's aide who'd stepped silently to my shoulder. "This isn't revenge, Dad," I said. "I want you to hear me on that. It isn't even anger, it's just accounting, and your account is closed." My father didn't move. He stared at the folder as the aide carried it away, his rented tuxedo suddenly hanging off him like it belonged to a bigger man, like he'd shrunk inside it while I watched. The tables around us, full of the people he'd spent his whole life wanting to impress, had gone silent, every one of them now in possession of the story. "I think you'd better get back to your party," the premier said, his public voice warm again, his eyes not warm at all. 60 years! Quite a milestone. You won't forget this one. My sister found her voice last, and it came out as a screech that turned heads 3 tables over. "You think you're so clever. You're still just a single mom. You're still the one who ruined everything 7 years ago. You spent your whole life performing success," I said, while I was busy having it. I let my eyes move to Spencer, who had quietly, without seeming to decide to, taken half a step away from her. "Spencer, I'd read your engagement situation carefully. Your future father-in-law's firm is about to be suspended from the largest infrastructure pipeline in the province, and the debt under it is older than your relationship." He didn't argue. He knew my world well enough to know that in it, the dress is nothing and the books are everything. The hotel's banquet manager appeared at the edge of the booth, wringing his hands. "Ms. Quinn, would you prefer somewhere more private?" "No," I said. I lifted my water glass and looked past all of them, out the tall windows at the city, throwing its light up into the cold. "The view's exactly right from here." Security came, polite and immovable, and gently herded my family toward the annex they'd reserved for their 25. My father went last. He stopped beside our booth for half a second, one hand on the back of a chair to steady himself, and he looked at me like I was a ghost of a daughter he thought he'd kept on a shelf. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left for him to say. The disappointing one had just closed the book on everything he'd built his name out of. Dinner went on. The 2 little girls had filled an entire children's menu with crayon, and the premier told my daughter a ridiculous story about a moose that got loose at Queen's Park until she laughed so hard she got the hiccups, and I realized I hadn't heard her laugh like that in front of my family, not once. In her whole life. The premier's wife and I talked about the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing impossible work and raising a person at the same time, and how nobody warns you. And how you do it anyway. I wasn't the guest who didn't belong. I was the host of my own life, finally, after years of being told I was renting space and everyone else's. Everything my father ever taught me about appearances turned out to be backwards. The label isn't the value, the silence wasn't weakness, and success was never the thing you perform for the people in the cheap seats. It's the quiet, unglamorous strength of knowing exactly who you are when the lights go down and nobody's watching, and there's no one left to impress. The house was quiet that night when we got home, but it was a different quiet than I'd lived in for years. Not the heavy, lonely quiet of a woman trying to prove she could survive. A light quiet. The quiet of a woman who already had. I tucked Junie into bed with her purple moose drawing taped to the wall where she could see it, and she was asleep before I finished the second page of the story, dreaming, I think, about the fountains in the lobby and her new friend in the green velvet dress. She didn't know anything about contracts or forged signatures or the firm that was about to come apart at the seams. All she knew was that her mother had laughed at dinner, and that was enough for her, which is its own quiet lesson if you sit with it. I poured a glass of water and sat in the dark of my living room and watched the snow start to come down under the streetlight. My phone was face up on the coffee table, lighting up over and over. I didn't have to look to know. A column of missed calls from my father. Texts from my mother. "We can fix this. Please call the premier. Your father didn't mean what he said all those years ago. You know how he is." A long, rambling voicemail from my sister that I could tell, just from the length of it, swung between cursing me out and begging me for the minister's private number. I picked up the phone. I didn't open the messages. I didn't listen to the voicemail. I opened the family group chat. It was named Quinn's Hun, and the icon was a photo from 5 Christmases ago where I'd been cropped to the very edge of the frame, half a shoulder and a sliver of my face. I sat looking at it for a long moment. Then I tapped settings and delete and exit and watched the whole thread fall into nothing. That was the part my father never understood and never will. He thought my success was a weapon I'd wield to force my way back into his good graces. He thought what I wanted, underneath all of it, was his apology. But I'd stopped wanting that somewhere around year 3. The truth was so much smaller and so much harder for a man like him to imagine. I didn't need him to finally see me. I just needed him to get out of the way. A few months later, I said yes to the federal board Spencer's father had been chasing me about. The announcement ran in the business section under my name, the real one, no code, no shadow. I wasn't the invisible architect anymore. I was on the masthead. My father's firm didn't survive the review. Without the corridor contract, the debt he'd been hiding under it came due all at once, and there was nothing left to hide it with. He didn't go to prison. I made sure the matter stayed civil and not criminal. The forged signature quietly absorbed into a settlement, which was the one mercy I allowed myself to extend, and the last one I ever owed him. But the firm was gone, and the house was gone, and the name he'd spent his whole life buffing to a shine was gone with it. Last I heard, they'd moved into a 2-bedroom condo out past the suburbs, and my mother had taken to telling anyone who'd sit still that Adeline simply got too important to make time for her own family anymore. She wasn't entirely wrong. I was busy. I was busy raising a kid who has never once doubted that she's the best thing in any room she walks into. I was busy putting my hands on the bones of the province and bending them toward something better. I was busy, finally, being exactly the person I'd been all along, the one they'd looked straight at for 7 years and refused to see. Sometimes people have to watch you at your absolute best before they understand they've been looking at you wrong the entire time. And the strange, freeing thing is that by the time they finally see it, you've already gone, and you're somewhere warm, and you're not waiting by the phone for them to say so. The best revenge was never the confrontation, never the folder, never the look on his face. It was the snow coming down outside a paid-off house and a little girl asleep with a purple moose on the wall, and the very particular silence of a woman who has finally, completely let herself off the hook. The thing I keep coming back to all this time later is that none of it happened by accident. My father didn't lose his firm because of bad luck or because the province had it in for him. He lost it because 7 years earlier he sat in his leather chair and decided that a daughter who chose her child was a daughter who'd amounted to nothing, and a man who builds his whole life on appearances eventually forges a signature to keep the appearance going. The note my mother sealed in that cream envelope wasn't the cause of anything. It was just the last entry in a ledger they'd been keeping against me since the day Junie was born. People imagine consequences arrive like lightning. They don't. They accumulate quietly like interest until one night they come due all at once in the middle of a ballroom. What I'd tell anyone watching, especially anyone who's the disappointing one in their own family, is that I didn't survive those years on anger. Anger would have burned out by year 2. I survived on 3 things, and I think they're the only things that ever really matter. The first is keeping your own conduct clean even when no one's clapping for it. I never lied to my parents about who I was. I just stopped explaining myself to people who'd already made up their minds, and there's a difference, and that difference let me sleep at night. The second is using your head instead of your hurt. I didn't show up at that party to scream. I showed up with a folder because I'd done the work, learned the file, read the books my father thought I'd never be smart enough to read. A clear mind beats a loud one every single time. And the third is the plain stubbornness to keep going when there's a newborn in a bassinet beside your desk and 60 hours of work in front of you and not one person in your corner. I built that house one brutal week at a time and nobody handed me a brick. Those 3 things don't make you cruel. That's what my family never understood. Spencer half stepped away from my sister not because I'd ruined her, but because he finally saw which one of us had spent her life on something real. You don't have to tear anyone down. You just have to become so completely yourself that the people who wrote you off have to live with what they couldn't see. So I don't tell Junie to be the smartest or the richest or the most impressive person in any room. I tell her to be honest when it costs her, to think before she reacts, and to keep walking when the road gets dark. Because I watched those 3 quiet things outlast every loud thing my family ever threw at me, and they're the only inheritance I trust enough to pass down.